Welcome to this brief lecture on secondary dominants in music theory. Let's begin by quickly reviewing the major scale and the chords based off of the major scale. If we build basic triads, remember we have a major triad on the first scale degree, a minor triad on the second scale degree, minor on the third scale degree, major on the fourth, major on the fifth, minor on the sixth, and a diminished triad based on the seventh scale degree. If we add another third above each of those triads based on the same scale, we add our seventh to each chord. So now instead of just a basic major chord, we have a major seventh. Remember, the major refers to that major seventh interval between the root and the seventh in a major chord. We don't have to notate that the chord itself is major because that is already inferred. In the D minor 7 chord we find on the second scale degree, that minor 7 refers to a minor triad, and the 7 by itself automatically refers to a minor seventh above the root of the chord. So D, F, A, C is a D minor 7. Same with an E minor 7 on this third scale degree. It's an E minor triad with a minor seventh at the top. F major 7 is the 4 chord with a major seventh at the top. G7 is our dominant seventh chord. Dominant because it is the 5 chord that wants to lead to the tonic. Remember, G is a major triad, and so there is no major or minor because major is inferred. And then the 7 is all by itself, which means there is a minor seventh above the root, G, B, D, F. This dominant 7 chord is what we will primarily be focusing on in this lecture. To finish up, an A minor 7 on the 6th chord. And then in the 7th scale degree, we have the unique B minor 7 flat 5. Remember, we had the diminished triad, and then we add a major third on top of that, which gives you that minor 7th, but you have a flatted 5 instead of an F sharp in a standard B minor 7 chord. To remind you how we would notate this in Nashville numbers, the 1, 2 with a minus for minor, 3 minor, 4, 5, 6, and 7 half diminished. So let's continue to look at these scale degrees. 5 to 1 is the most powerful progression. It's the strongest tendency that we see in music, especially when it's a dominant 5-7 chord to the tonic. The bass moves up a fourth, or it would move down a fifth to the tonic, to the root of the entire key. The leading tone, which in this case is the B, moves up to the tonic, and the seventh of the chord, in this case an F of a G7 chord, would move down to the E, which is the third of the tonic. Again, this 5 to 1, it's cadential, it's a cadence. At the end of a song or an end of a section, we see it as a very strong progression, the 5 to 1 or dominant to tonic progression. This 5 to 1 relationship is similar to any position in the scale where we see the bass move up a perfect fourth or down a perfect fifth. So in this case, we see D going up to G. The 2 minor chord up to the 5 is similar to the 5 to the 1. It's not as strong because you don't have the major triad going to a major triad, but you have a minor triad going to a major triad. However, secondary dominance is where we alter the first chord to make it a stronger progression as it's heading to the second chord. And that's what we're going to look at today. Secondary dominance is when we see the second chord of a pair as a temporary tonic. Think of this as the target. This temporary tonic can best be approached by a dominant 5 chord found in its own key. In this case, G would be the temporary tonic target. So the 5 chord of G would be the dominant, and that 5 chord of G is D major, or even stronger, a D7 chord. But right now in the key of C, we don't have a D7 chord. We have a D minor 7 chord. We want this to be a 5-to-1 feel. So we are going to temporarily change in our mindset and in the understanding of how these chords are functioning together. We're going to temporarily pretend we are in the key of G. So G would be 1, and D needs to be a 5. So what do? From a D minor 7 chord, we're going to change this to a D7 chord. To do that, we raise the F to an F sharp. F sharp does not exist in the key of C. We are borrowing it from the key of G. It appears as an accidental in our song or in our chord progression. We're borrowing it because we're temporarily pretending or we're functioning as though we are in the key of G. This is what secondary dominance is. When you suspend your current key, the original key, and you temporarily move into another key and borrow chords, especially that 5-to-1 relationship from the new key. The D is acting as the dominant chord of G. We would phrase this as the 5 of 5 because D is the 5 of the G chord, which is the 5 in the original key. So this is the 5 of 5. The D is the 5 of G, which is the 5 of C. Are you following me? This song may remain temporarily in G for a phrase, a section, or once G is played, it returns to C. That just sort of depends on the other chords in the progression. But for this instance, we see the G chord and the D chord as acting in the key of G. And that is what allows us to have a D, F sharp, A, C, even temporarily. Let's look at another chord progression, right? We're going to look at E to A, right? Remember, we're going to take A and make that be our target, our temporary tonic, right? Right now, E to A are both minor chords, and we see an E minor 7 going to an A. And that is not a 5-to-1. If A minor is the target, we want the 5 to be a dominant chord going to that target. Now, we've not talked much about minor keys, but in most minor keys, you will still have a dominant 5 chord going to a minor tonic. Okay? So, instead of an E minor 7, what are we going to do? We're going to change this to an E dominant 7 chord. We are going to raise the G to a G sharp, and now we have a 5 of 6. So the E7 is acting as the dominant 7 chord, and it is the 5 chord of A minor. A minor is the 6 minor in the key of C. So this is a 5 of 6 minor. Let's look at one more. We're going to look at the relationship between A minor and D minor. If D is our target, our temporary tonic, D minor is our temporary tonic, A would be the dominant of D, right? D, E, F, G, A. It looks different in this slide because I didn't want to wrap around the octave in our scale. So we're going down to D, but it is still that 5-to-1 relationship. So if D minor is our target and A needs to be a dominant chord, we're going to go from an A minor 7 chord, which is the 6 minor 7 chord found in the key of C, the natural chord found on the 6th scale degree, and we are going to adapt that or alter it so it becomes the dominant 7 chord for the key of D minor. This is now the 5 of 2, or the 5-7 of 2 minor. Now, one thing that is interesting about secondary dominants is you can string them together and they can create a very strong directed pathway from one chord to the next to the next. Remember, a 5-7 to a 1 is the most strongest progression that you will see in music theory. So let's combine two secondary dominants back to back. We have A7 chord, and it has taken us to the D minor as the 1. That is the temporary target, right? However, let's say D actually becomes a secondary dominance itself. We already talked that D7 wants to go to G. So A7 takes us to a D, but D7 takes us to a G. So now we have two secondary dominants functioning in sequential order. A7 to D7 to G. So we would say that this is a 5 of 2, and then that is followed by a 5 of 5, and then that leads us to the 5. Okay, let's take a moment and just review how these are written. You want to refer to secondary dominant relationships. You'll say it's a 5-7 of 2, and then a 5-7 of 5, and then a 5, as we just talked about, right? If we were writing chords, we would just simply write an A7 chord to a D7 chord to a G chord. Now you're in the key of C, and so an A7 chord naturally does not show up in the key of C. However, this is why it makes sense. You'd have an A7 that's going to take you to a D7. Again, the D7 doesn't show up in the key of C either, but the D7 can exist in the key of C because it is the 5 of 5. And now it's going to the G chord. In Nashville notation, we would write a 6-7, a 2-7, and then a 5. Notice that these are all dominant chords, and they do not have a minor 7 notation. Either the minus or the lowercase m does not exist, and you have to take that out because the number by itself or the chord name by itself in the chords is naturally major, and these are major triads, right? They're dominant 7 chords. So it's no longer a minor chord when it is used as secondary dominants. Okay. So, to review, you start with a standard key. We've been working in the key of C, but this would work in any key. And then as long as you have a dominant chord, it is going to force you to go to the tonic of that temporary chord. It's going to go up a perfect fourth or down a perfect fifth. And you can string dominant 7 chords together to make a sequence of secondary dominants. Let's follow the bouncing ball, shall we? We will start with E. E is going to be our first secondary dominant chord, and E7 is going to push us to A, right? So this is a 5 of 6. However, let's make this 6 actually be a secondary dominance as well. And the secondary dominance A is going to push us to a D chord. So this is the 5 of 2. So we've had a 5 of 6, now going to a 5 of 2. Let's keep it going. that 5 of 2 brings us to the 2 chord. And if we make the 2 chord a dominant 7 chord, it is going to take us to the 5. D7 is a dominant 7 chord of G. So we've gone from a 3-7 to a 6-7 to a 2-7 to a 5. And this 5 naturally wants to finally let us resolve to the original tonic of the key, which would be C. So in the key of C, you could have an E7 chord, which makes you go to an A7 chord makes you go to a D7 chord makes you go to a G, and the G7 chord makes you go to the C.